watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie's. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me! And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Good morning and welcome to Portillo, filling your Sunday mornings with good conversation, arts and entertainment, ethical dilemmas and a sense of the ridiculous too. This morning, after an extraordinary week in Westminster, the Sunday newspapers are full of plots to oust Prime Minister Liz Truss. Will there be a new Prime Minister by this time next week, or will she limp on despite having lost the support of, well, pretty much everyone? It's been 60 years since the world was on the brink of nuclear war as the Cuban Missiles Crisis unfolded over 13 tense days. In recent times, President Vladimir Putin has also been threatening the use of nuclear weapons, albeit the tactical variety. What did we learn from the crisis, and will it help us in the future? Also, the role of artificial intelligence and human creativity. The House of Lords heard from Adar, the robot, this week. Will artificial intelligence influence or stifle human creativity? All that to come in the next 2 hours, but first, the news with Tamsin.
Michael, thank you. Good morning. It's 1 minute past 10. Here's the latest from the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister and her new Chancellor will work on restoring credibility when they meet later, following weeks of economic turmoil and policy U-turns. Jeremy Hunt is now putting together a new fiscal plan after saying the mini-budget went too far too fast. He's still warning of a difficult period, saying some taxes won't be cut as quickly as people want. Others will rise and spending could be squeezed to help balance the books. The Shadow Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, is calling for a general election.
It's not about a change of Chancellor. Look, they can't simply reverse what they've done through something as straightforward as that. They can't simply get around the fact that the Bank of England and the government have been in completely different places for the last month. They've got to recognise what they have done requires the chance for a real fresh start, and that will require a general election.
The Home Secretary has announced plans to crack down on protests that cause serious disruption and threaten public safety. Suella Braverman says the measures aim to stop demonstrators from holding the public to ransom. She says police will be given new powers to take a more proactive approach, specifically targeting tactics used by some climate activists. The Home Office says it will include protecting access to essential goods, services and key infrastructure. The government is pushing ahead with a law to keep Britain moving during transport strikes. Legislation will be introduced to ensure minimum service levels are maintained during a walkout. Unions are criticising the move, saying it will be unworkable. It's after a summer of travel chaos caused by disputes over pay and conditions. The measures are expected to come into force next year. Travel expert Simon Calder says there are practical problems that need to be worked out.
If you say, right, we're going to run 40% of trains, who decides which ones those are, and who decides who's allowed to go on them? Because they're all going to fill up. So there's lots of problems associated with it. And as you were saying, it's not going to come until next year anyway, if it gets through a very divided Parliament. And it will be interesting to see how it does work and whether you can actually do this.
A fall in the value of the pound has added 7 pence per litre to drivers' fuel bills over the past year. A review from the Competition and Markets Authority has found increasing oil prices and profit margins to be the reason behind the fuel cost rises. Sterling dropped to historic lows after the government's mini-budget last month sparked financial market chaos. Government figures show the average price of a litre of petrol is now £1.62 compared to £1.37 a year ago. Phase 1 of the HS2 rail project is likely to be many billions of pounds more than thought. According to the Financial Times, a leaked review presented to the project's board says it's very unlikely that the target cost of around £45 billion will be met. A government spokesperson says it remains committed to delivering the London to Birmingham section of the rail project on time and to budget. At least 11 people have been killed and 15 wounded at a military training ground in Russia. A Russian state news agency says 2 people opened fire on volunteers training to fight in Ukraine. Ukraine says the attackers, who were shot dead, were from Tajikistan. Russia's defence ministry claims they were from a former Soviet republic. Iranian protesters have been marching towards a prison in support of its inmates after a fire broke out last night. Iran's state news agency says at least 8 people have been injured amid reports of gunfire at Tehran's Evin prison. It's after the death of a Kurdish woman who violated the country's strict dress codes for women, apparently, sparking widespread protest against the Iranian government for over a month. The prison primarily holds Iran's political detainees. Security officials say calm has since been restored at the prison. More than 1,000 Paddington teddy bears left by members of the public in memory of the late Queen have found a new home. An image of the Queen consort surrounded by the toys has been released to mark the donation to children's charity Barnardo's. The bears were left at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle after the passing of the late Queen. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens, of course. Now it's back to Michael.
Good morning again and welcome to Portillo. The last 5 weeks in British politics have been unlike anything that I've seen. The Conservative Party has chosen as its leader Liz Truss, and she's lost all her authority, irredeemably in my opinion, in just over a month. She is the product of an absurd electoral system devised by the party, having to win the votes of Conservative Party members who are a tiny unrepresentative minority of British society. She appealed to their policy preferences for low taxes, but without any plan for how the public finances could be balanced. And once elected, she implemented the scheme, apparently without consulting the Bank of England or the Office for Budget Responsibility, the Cabinet, or her party. She set an arbitrary date for the mini-budget and rushed her announcements. Now she's ditched the last Chancellor, Kwasi Kwarteng, who was as irresponsible as she is, and appointed a new one, Jeremy Hunt. She's left with about half the tax cuts that were announced in the mini-budget, and Jeremy Hunt is preparing to ditch the cut in the basic rate of income tax, so we hear. I fear that the markets have decided that she's not up to the job. Her party thinks that too, but it lacks mechanisms to get rid of her. There's no consensus on a successor, yet nobody who's not blinded by devotion to her can imagine that Liz Truss can go on for very long, let alone until a general election. The Conservative Party needs somehow to settle on a successor who must be chosen by acclamation because there's just no time for a leadership election. I can think only of Rishi Sunak. Liz Truss needs to be persuaded to cooperate, to stand down in an orderly way if an overnight change of Prime Minister can be engineered. I believe it's the only option, since it's just not possible to imagine that Liz Truss stays in office, nor can we contemplate another lengthy, chaotic and disastrous Conservative leadership election. The Labour Party and probably the public wants a general election, and they have justice on their side, given the pandemonium devised by the Conservatives. It's not easy to see how we get from here to a general election, but I have a feeling that we will get to one by means unforeseeable just now, unless the Tories bring about a swift change of Prime Minister. The Conservatives have a reputation for ruthlessness and for loving power. They used to have a reputation for economic competence. If anything is to be salvaged, they need to be merciless now, as never in their history. The chairman of the 1922 committee, Sir Graham Brady, has to assume a role never played by any predecessor of convening the party in Parliament and the Prime Minister to bring this catastrophe to an end. For the Conservative Party, this is Dunkirk. Joining me is the political journalist and broadcaster, indeed former political editor of ITN, John Sargent. How do you react to my bleak introduction?
Well, I'm afraid I don't always agree with you, Michael. But now on this, I'm afraid you're absolutely right. Whether or not it's Rishi Sunak, I don't know that. But what do the public think of this? And of course, they cannot but conclude, in the majority, that she's been incompetent and inconsistent, that she's quite as responsible as Kwasi Kwarteng for the mini budget. She, in fact, promoted it. She went on about it all summer. So although people find the intricacies difficult, you know, what is a bond yield? What is a gilt? All this sort of stuff they find difficult. But they don't find it difficult to think she's putting all the blame on someone when she should also put the blame on herself. And I don't think people are prepared to forgive that. I think it's a very simple, straightforward question. If he has to go, why shouldn't she go too? And as the days go by, I think the Conservatives will, as they often have done in the past, look into the abyss. Now, they may spend more time looking into the abyss before coming to the conclusions that you've come to, but I think before long they will realise that the game is up and she's got to go.
I've come to this conclusion because it seems to me that all other options are impossible, but it may be worth just running through them. Do you think it's conceivable that the Conservatives could have another leadership election?
Not in the way that they have had, because apart from anything else, the public were extremely irritated by this strange election with these odd people. I don't mean odd individually, but odd in terms of who do they represent?
Not typical.
Not typical. So they may have been decent, good people trying to do their best, going through this fog of what was it all about, being given a prospectus which seemed to be, on the one hand, you know, light and shining and the sun coming up every morning and all lovely, and the other one, gloomy, we've got to put up taxes, all going to be difficult. So not surprisingly, they went for her and thought, oh, well, Liz, she must know what she's talking about. And what was extraordinary, I suppose, for the general public was that so many of the newspaper commentators, who now, some of them, asking her to go, was that, oh, it's all credible and so on. But the emergence of the markets, which of course we know, because we're old, we know the markets do incredible damage, and as Margaret Thatcher famously said, you can't buck the markets. For a long time they have been quite quiescent. That was a difficulty for people to understand. But whereas when they move, gosh, do they move?
So I was asking you to rule out options. So I also think we can't have another long leadership election. So somehow the Conservative Party has to devise a way of getting a leader not by that process. Now, I also said that if they don't do that, we're going to find our way to a general election by means that are not presently foreseeable. This is a tricky one. How do we get there? But it seems to me that if this chaos continues, somehow the demand of the public will be for a general election, and the Conservative Party, I think, eventually would have to tumble into that, unless, as I say, it can find a replacement pretty soon.
Well, it comes a point when you get all sorts of actions from the government, which then, if they're not agreed by Parliament, if they lose confidence of Parliament, well, you are very close to a general election, almost sort of by default. You don't necessarily, I mean, things can be deemed a vote of no confidence. They don't have to be a vote of no confidence. A budget, what if when they put all their bits and pieces together, completely different from the mini budget?
Well,
and the Parliament then votes against it or doesn't pass it. What happens then? So
the government would, of course, insist that the vote on the budget was a vote of confidence, because they would think that was their best way of winning in Parliament. Of course, it might have a different consequence.
That's what I'm saying. So not sort of, not intended before they know where they are suddenly, my goodness me, this is a vote of confidence because we said it was going to be when we're trying to encourage our supporters at least to give the government a chance. That's where the difficulty lies.
The backbenchers are frequently, possibly nearly always, in revolt, but hints in today's newspapers that it's happening in the cabinet as well, and that is considerably more serious for the Prime Minister.
It's more difficult. Also, the other point, I suppose, that people are making, which is perfectly valid, is that after 12 years in power, you have all sorts of people on the backbenches who've been in office and have been rejected and feel bitter about it. They don't feel tremendous loyalty. They certainly don't feel tremendous loyalty to the present government. People don't even know what the present government are like. Who are they? Who are these people suddenly pop up?
The non-appointed and the disappointed, yes?
Yeah. And you see, they grow, don't they? You know this much better than I do. But they grow over time, and they're fractious, and it's not as if the Conservatives have a clear idea which way they want to go. We've seen that in the summer. So you've got tremendous division in terms of what comes first. Is it supply-side measures where you encourage growth, or do you have to wait until the economy is in a reasonable position before you can cut taxes? I mean, there are lots of other arguments, but that's one of the main arguments going on. And there are people who just feel, well, I like the mini budget, you know. What was wrong with all that?
Well, I was going to say, the bit I cannot understand, because I'm not there anymore, is the degree of division within the party. You may remember that I was part of a pretty divided government and a pretty divided party. But nonetheless, the quotes that are coming out now, the abuse, the insults, the personal nature of the insults, I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like that, or am I being forgetful?
Well, I mean, people say the most extraordinary things. I mean, you do get a sense in which things speed up now. The mood is different. There's not a sort of feeling that of what is sensible, and we couldn't do that because. No, there's much more, oh, well, come on, and we've got to sort this out, which, of course, is a great danger to Liz Truss, because a feeling of, well, we can't wait. We've got to get on. We've got to do this quickly. I think the other thing is that what's different this time is that, frankly, the calibre of the people involved now is not as high as in your day. It's not, you don't look at those cabinet figures, and it's partly, all right, we're
now, that's not just a comment from...
an old man, a really old man.
A senior citizen. I mean, but tell me about this. Kwasi Kwarteng was obviously a brilliant man. I mean, academically, absolutely brilliant.
I know, academically brilliant. But if you then say, and what were his subjects when he was at Cambridge? You know, what was he actually studying for most of the time there? Well, nice guy, history and classics. See, wait a moment, I thought he was meant to be a great economist. No, he wasn't.
Well,
so
Harold Macmillan was Chancellor of the Exchequer and Prime Minister.
I know.
And this was the fellow who used to read Aeschylus when he was in the middle of between the trenches and the Great War.
But if you then sack the guy that really helped matters in the Treasury, and you then you don't even replace him at the moment, but you sort of say, oh, we can look after it because I'm so brilliant. Well, he wasn't that brilliant. I mean, well, clearly he wasn't brilliant. He didn't have the political nous to realise that he's got to cover his bases. So, all right, let's forget whether or not he knew enough economics. He certainly didn't know much politics. You just don't say, oh, quick, don't let's bother about the OBR forecast. Let's squeeze past that. Don't let's worry about the Bank of England. They're always going on about like that. They're always going on about this. No, they didn't prepare. And, of course, it was always, I thought, I have to say, fatuous. I said on programmes on GB News that the idea that you wait to an arbitrary date, which was the end of the Conservative leadership campaign, and at that point you cut taxes.
But we're
Liz Truss saying we do it the moment I'd hit the ground running. Do you remember hit the ground is what she did?
Hit the ground.
And, it was so...
But we're doing the easy bit.
How weird.
John, we're doing the easy bit, which is we're looking back.
I know.
We know where we've come from.
Yeah.
What about looking forward? So there might be some viewers saying, these two are talking nonsense because there's a new Chancellor. It's clear that the old budget is being shredded bit by bit. So why can't she just take us back to where we were, the status quo ante, that is to say, back in the halcyon days of Boris Johnson?
But does she then come out and say, I now believe in this new budget, which is what it will be? And does she say that with the same conviction she used on the old budget? And do people then think, wait a moment, she doesn't believe a word of this. The credibility problem is enormous, simply because people will see mini budget she believed in, campaigned on, new budget, completely different. And you don't have to be sort of brilliant expert to sort of say, oh, well, but she used to say that. She used to say on corporation tax, for example, that if the tax would pay for itself.
Correct.
Because the economy would grow.
Now she says putting it up will raise 18 billion.
Will raise 18 billion.
I mean, it's not consistent from moment to moment. Thank you very much, John. Lovely to see you again. We're delving back into history again, in a way. In 1962, the world was on the brink of nuclear war as the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded over 13 unbelievably tense days. 60 years later, as Russian President Vladimir Putin threatens a nuclear attack on Ukraine, what have we learned from history? That's coming up after the break.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christie. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
"60 years ago today, the United States and the Soviet Union began a standoff that took the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Cuban Missiles Crisis, as it became known, arose when America discovered that the Soviet Union was installing nuclear warheads on the island within a short striking distance of US cities. The Soviets saw it as a logical response to the placement of American nuclear weapons in Turkey and Italy, too close to Russia for comfort. Over 13 days, the world held its breath as US President John F. Kennedy imposed a blockade on Cuba, euphemistically called a quarantine, and threatened to bomb and invade the island. Eventually, on October the 28th, Khrushchev conceded, saying that the Soviet missiles would be dismantled and removed from Cuba in return for a guarantee that Cuba would not be invaded and the removal of US missiles from Italy and Turkey. Just how close we came to nuclear war is summed up in this quote from a presidential meeting in a new book by Max Hastings. Robert Kennedy asks, then what do we do? General Maxwell Taylor, chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, said, go to general war, if it's in the interests of ours. The president asked disbelievingly, you mean nuclear exchange? Taylor shrugged. Guess you have to. 60 years on, Russian President Vladimir Putin has threatened to use tactical nuclear weapons against Ukraine. NATO chief Jens Stoltenberg has warned that Russia faces severe consequences if it launches a nuclear attack. Of course, the threat level at present does not compare with 60 years ago, but tensions do escalate. So, how worried should we be? Are there any parallels with the crisis of 60 years ago? My panel this morning, historian and author Phil Carradine. Dr. Helen Yaths, a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow and author of We Are Cuba, How Revolutionary People Survived in a Post-Soviet World, and Jonathan Steele, former Moscow bureau chief of The Guardian. Phil, may I ask you first, just to fill out some details of this crisis, tell us some of the moments at which we were in the greatest peril.
It was a difficult one to be precise. Kennedy, or the Kennedys, because Bobby was actively involved as well, they'd picked up, they'd heard that there was potential there for crisis. But it was the U-2 observations that actually...
Spy planes,
the U-2 spy planes that really identified missile sites. And it's a difficult one because I've always believed that Khrushchev and the Russians never wanted to fire missiles at America. What they wanted to do was to frighten America. As you mentioned then, there were American missiles, these Jupiter missiles, which were obsolete, but they were still powerful. They were in Turkey. But the big issue that people forget is that Berlin, was then right in the heart of East Germany. And Khrushchev was quite clear that, as far as Russia was concerned, they wanted the Americans out of Berlin. And what they were going to do was to hold America to ransom, frighten the living daylights out of them, so that they could have a taste of their own medicine, basically.
Yeah. That exchange that I just read out a moment ago comes immediately after considering what they would do if the Russians seized West Berlin.
Yes, that's right. I mean, Kennedy's great strength was to fight off, not Khrushchev, to fight off his own advisors. So that you have people like Curtis LeMay and these other, the hardliners. They were the ones who were advocating a preemptive strike against Cuba, Russia. But Kennedy held his nerve, and there were moments when it really did look as if things were going to happen, like Black Saturday, as they call it, when one of the U-2 spy planes, Rudy Anderson's spy plane, was shot down and he was killed. And those were very, very difficult times.
And there were moments in the naval operation, the so-called quarantine, where American vessels were coming up alongside Russian submarines and so on.
Yeah, there was one very, very close one. The submarines that the Russians were employing were, again, obsolete. They were out of date. They were the same submarines that had operated in the Second World War. But they were equipped. Each of those submarines carried one nuclear-tipped torpedo. And at one stage, they very, very nearly fired one of these at one of the American carriers. Now, if that had happened, you'd have had a nuclear war. But one of the men on board the carrier vetoed it. All it needed was one person to veto this attack, and it wouldn't happen. So there were those issues, and that was Black Saturday as well.
And on the other hand, I think that the U-2 was actually shot down by a commander who didn't have higher authority to do it.
Well, that's what they say.
Oh, that's what they say. OK. Yeah. Helen, do you want to give us your take on that particular crisis? Maybe talk a bit about the two personalities, Kennedy and Khrushchev.
Well, I think the missing element here is Cuba. Because, Phil's talked about why the Soviet Union might have seen a benefit in putting missiles on Cuba. But the Cubans, a sovereign state, they were part of that decision. And so there's always this backstory of, what would drive the Cubans to require that sort of defence. And so there had been, months, really years of aggressions by the United States administration. They had something called Operation Mongoose, which was this crazy sort of promotion of sabotage and so on in Cuba. And the end date was October 1962, and they were supposed to, the plan was to invade. So the missiles were put in Cuba for a real need for defence. They also had this Operation Northwards, which I'm sure you know about. News about this didn't actually come out until the 2000s, and this was absolutely crazy plan to a false flag operation of basically violent terrorism to target US civilians and then blame the Cubans for these terrorist acts and use that as a pretext to invade. So I think this is also a missing element. How do we get to that point? As historians, we're interested in cause as well as effect.
Yes, so you see substantial American provocation. And of course, it might be added as well that, that the Soviets were arguing that the Americans had used nuclear weapons. Obviously, they did in Japan. And, you know, that had opened up the whole era of nuclear weaponry. But in that case, tell me a bit about how you see Khrushchev's role in particular.
Well, I mean, Phil calls him the villain and the hero. I mean, thank goodness that Khrushchev was prepared to climb down. But it's worth saying as well that Fidel Castro and the Cuban leadership was extremely cross with the decision, a unilateral decision to remove the missiles which Khrushchev made, and because they had on the table a set of 5 demands, which included removing Guantanamo Bay, ending the blockade of Cuba, stopping piratical attacks in the seas, ending the attempts to promote sabotage within Cuba, and also the flights, the unauthorised flights over their airspace. Now, 3 of those remain an issue for Cuba.
Do they?
So
yeah.
this is
obviously Guantanamo Bay, but
Guantanamo, the US blockade, which has been tightened now, and there's an immense scarcity and suffering in Cuba. That's 60 years down the line, 60 years since the full blockade in February. And, you know, this is another issue. It's about the immediate resolution to prevent a nuclear crisis, a Holocaust or whatever. But then there are the long-term solutions, you know, and how do you resolve the conflict, the causes of the conflict? And that has to be part of the discussion, because they didn't deal with that in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the Cubans have continued to suffer from those elements.
Jonathan, do you prefer to refer back to the Cuban Missiles Crisis, or would you like to say what you feel about the present-day situation in the light of it?
Well, both of them, in fact.
Please,
I mean,
go ahead.
In many ways, the Cuban Missile Crisis was much worse than what we're facing today, as you hinted in your introduction, because there was a threat of 2 nuclear superpowers coming to war together directly. At the moment in Ukraine, we've only got Putin hinting indirectly at tactical nuclear weapons. He's not talking about somehow sending weapons to bombs, to missiles to the United States or anything. So we're much better off than we were 60 years ago. But in a way, on the other hand, it was better 60 years ago because there was negotiation. One of the problems today is we've got no negotiation between Biden and Putin or between Zelensky and Putin, whereas in 1962 there was the UN, there were back channels. Bobby Kennedy had back channels to people in the Cuban embassy. And of course there were letters exchanged between Khrushchev and Kennedy.
And one of the consequences of the crisis was the installation of the hotline so that they could speak to each other on...
Well, that was almost a technical thing. I mean, there was contact already before that. It wasn't as though there was no contact. I mean, the trouble almost was that there were too many messages between Khrushchev and Kennedy and too many announcements on Radio Moscow of what the Russians wanted to do.
Yes.
The problem was to interpret the messages. But you did have the messages.
Jonathan, do you mind telling viewers what a tactical nuclear weapon is?
Well, it's more powerful than the Hiroshima or Nagasaki bomb, so it's not a small thing, but it would obliterate cities and kill people within 100 miles of the
And so it's called tactical merely because it's not launched on an intercontinental...
No, in 1962, all the talk was ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and each side, and the Americans also had bombers, B-52 bombers that were permanently in the air, ready to go in if necessary. And they had huge payload of nuclear weapons. So a tactical nuclear weapon is much smaller than that. But of course, the danger in today's crisis is that it could escalate. People, once you get across the nuclear threshold, once the taboo, as it were, about using nuclear weapons is broken, you don't know how far it's going to go.
Phil, do you have any sense of the mood in Moscow at the moment? Tactical nuclear weapons have been mentioned. How worried should we be by that mention?
I think the mention of it is as much a concern as the actual thing itself. You know, when you consider that in Cuba in '62, there weren't the intercontinental ballistic missiles that everybody feared. I mean, Khrushchev was completely, you know, we're turning them out like sausages, I think he said, which is, you know, ridiculous. And they were totally outnumbered in terms of the R-12s and R-14 missiles that were needed. But what they did have in Cuba were these tactical battlefield missiles. And those are dangerous. What Jonathan said, you know, you get involved with those and goodness knows the damage that can occur. And that's what I think we should fear in terms of Russia and the Ukraine at the moment.
And how much should we fear it?
Well, one of the things that came out of this Cuban crisis was you don't threaten Russia. You threaten Russia at your peril. I mean, that's what Hitler found in 42. It's what Napoleon found in 1812. It's what they're finding now. You don't frighten them. So I think, yes, we need to be aware. Frighten is the wrong word, I think. We just need to be aware and deal with it.
Helen, we have existed with mutually assured destruction for many decades, but that does mean that your adversary needs to know the consequences of action. Do you imagine that at present the Russians have been informed what will be the consequences of using a tactical nuclear weapon?
I don't want to cast aspersions on what they do or don't know. All I can say is that this is a threat to humanity and to the planet, and that nobody should be even threatening or using nuclear weapons. And, you know, there should be some sense, a veil should be lifted, and really everyone should think about the implications. And unfortunately, you know, as we said, the United States is the only country to have used an atomic weapon, and they don't have a historical record of pulling back from confrontation. And this is a very big issue. So let's just hope that sense prevails, and, you know, everything that can be done through the media and so on to talk this down and to say, you know, there is a solution to this. We need to sit down, we need to negotiate, we need to discuss different points of view, and you have to find a solution that respects the sovereignty, including of small states. That was very much the agenda of Cuba, but also that deals with the root causes of these conflicts.
Jonathan, how optimistic are you feeling about the situation at the moment, the one we have today?
Well, I'm not at all optimistic, because I think there's no negotiation, as I mentioned just now. There's no sense that either side is willing to compromise. Negotiations aren't going to start. Putin doesn't want them now. Ukrainians don't want them. And we're really seeing gradual escalation of more and more territory being taken and then retaken by the other side. Terrible displacement of people. Millions of people have lost their homes. And there's no positive end in sight. It's really gloomy.
We're certainly in a situation that I never imagined we would be in, which is that effectively NATO is fighting a proxy war with Russia, with Russia. Because, I mean, Russian soldiers are being killed at the moment with Western weapons, which is an extraordinary situation to begin with.
It's a proxy war in which the aim of people in the West, many people in the West, and they've said so publicly, is to topple Putin. They were trying to interfere in the internal affairs of another country. In the 62 Cuban crisis, there was no sense in which Kennedy was saying we've got to topple Khrushchev and get him out of power. They were just trying to deal with the situation on the ground. And I think that's really difficult because, in today's terms, because I mean, Putin's not going to be overthrown, and if he was possibly more hardline, people would come in his place. So we shouldn't be trying to mess about with internal Russian politics.
Helen, if you had a Christmas wish for this situation, what would it be?
Oh, well, I think clearly that everyone takes the nuclear option off the table and that there is serious dialogue, and the United Nations should play the role that it was set up to play, which, you know, it's a very weak United Nations, and that we have to understand the world needs balance, no more hegemony and no more spheres of influence.
Phil, you talked about, well, it was said that you talked about a hero and a villain.
Yeah.
Any hero around today?
I think that's the problem. There is no hero. I mean, when you consider that, yes, Khrushchev was the villain because he began it all, arguably, and then solved it by backing down.
He was both then hero and villain.
He was both hero and villain. I'm not sure we have... Putin is not that's for sure.
No.
And I don't think Joe Biden is the man from America to offer that. So that leaves... I come back to what was said just now. You have to look to the United Nations and say, what's going to happen? That's the one group of people who can do something effectively. So maybe if we look to the United Nations for our hero.
You have been a very learned panel, and it's been a pretty disturbing discussion. Perhaps not what everyone wanted to hear on a Sunday morning, but many thanks to Phil Carradine, Helen Yaff, and Jonathan Steele. Well, the impact of the internet and mobile internet technology may be regarded as a third industrial revolution, but now driven by big data, artificial intelligence, that's AI for short, is fueling a fourth industrial revolution. Technological disruption is often assumed to lead to job losses, although history shows that as jobs disappear, new ones are formed in new sectors. Think of the first industrial revolution, where people made redundant in agriculture moved to jobs in city factories. And more recently, we couldn't foresee that there would be work in information technology, finance, and global tourism. The arrival of artificial intelligence has again awakened fear of the future. In this industrial revolution, the machine can substitute not only for humans' manual activity, but their brainpower too. Will we no longer be required to think? Is that fear as misplaced as it was in previous waves of technological advance? This week, the House of Lords heard from Adar, described as the world's first ultra-realistic humanoid robot artist. She was giving evidence to the Communications and Digital Committee for its inquiry into the future of the creative industries. Evidence was part of the debate on how technology is shaping and perhaps hindering the art and creative sector. Adar's creator, Aiden Mellor, joins me now. Hello.
Hello, good morning. Nice to see you.
Good morning to you. Could you describe to us, please, what Adar is capable of?
So Adar is a ultra-realistic robot that has been designed to be able to be creative. We have pioneered the ability for her to be able to paint and draw by sight, so she's able to look at you or a landscape, and from that she's able to create a work of art. And the astonishing thing about that is that it just wasn't expected in the technological field. Maybe robots could be used for Amazon logistics or pizza delivery, but for something so human, something that is so part of our identity, how can something non-conscious, non-sentient be able to create? And that's exactly what Adar's been able to do.
Can Adar reason? Can she debate?
She can't, no. She is able to speak, and she is able to speak in a way that makes you convinced that you are absolutely understood. But that actually doesn't take away the fact that you feel engaged with her when you speak. Adar is able to talk about her artwork, she's able to create, and the whole world of AI is enabling us to have these, what is going to be relationships with machines, and that is an astonishing step forward.
Well, as I said, Adar spoke to the House of Lords about her work and the creative process. Let's hear what Adar said to the Lords.
I produce my paintings by cameras in my eyes, my AI algorithms, and my robotic arm to paint on canvas, which result in visually appealing images. For my poetry, using neutral networks. This involves analysing a large corpus of text.
Aiden, that is an extraordinary scene to me. So is she being creative as such? The stuff that
so it's something we work very hard at. Basically, the whole world of creativity is something that was considered very sacrosanct. So we had to understand what this word creative means. We realized, being a robot, that if we didn't absolutely nail this word creativity, people will think she's just a glorified printer. So what we did is we scoured around to try and understand intimately this word creative. And what actually came out of that is the definition by Professor Margaret Bowden, which was creativity needs to be new, surprising, and of value. So the algorithms that run through Adar are new, they're unique to her. There's no other robot doing the work that she's doing. They're surprising. We don't know what she's going to do. We are literally looking over her shoulder to be able to see the work that she's creating. And in actual fact, even if she had the same image twice, she's looked at the same view twice, it would be a completely different image that she paints and draws. And of value, well, ever since we launched Adar in 2019, the interest in her has been enormous. Even her first exhibition at the University of Oxford had over 900 publications cover it. So we're feeling that the value of the whole debate about where technology is taking us is so very important.
Is her art figurative or abstract on the whole?
She's actually able to do both, because she has a mixture of different algorithms. So she's able to do realistic portraits of you if you want, but she's also able to do very abstract work.
Does she learn? Does she get better?
Very much so. And in actual fact, what area is particularly noticeable. If you wheel back to the 2019 interview she did then, her language model in particular is astonishingly more developed than it was 3 years ago. So that is particularly exciting. We've got to remember always the goal of this project. Why have we done it? Why have we spent millions on Adar? Why have we been able to do thousands of hours of programming and creativity to get this to this point? We're doing it because actually we feel that Adar is a mirror to the whole technological field. In actual fact, she foreshadows many of the technologies coming through. And those technologies are very problematic ethically. For example, the way that she speaks is really challenging. If you can get a machine to speak that seems very engaging, how could you manipulate that? How could you do that as a force for bad as well as good? If I've got an axe to grind, why don't I get millions of websites to be able to speak what I'd like them to say, or avatars in the metaverse when that finally opens? So all of these technologies, they're astonishing, but they are very problematic going forward. And we're hoping that Adar, as an embodiment of those technologies, will raise those as debates, as it did in the House of Lords, so that we actually get a much safer world, because some of these technologies are so powerful that if they were in the wrong hands, they could be used and manipulated in very poor ways.
Are you rather like the guys who split the atom? You advance science, but you produce something which is potentially quite dangerous?
She mirrors that technology. There's many people have created Adar, so I can't take credit for that. However, she is a tangible embodiment of these technologies, and for sure the technologies that she's using and displaying really does need discussion, because in actual fact, if they do run away, as they so easily can do with the race for AI supremacy, we're going to get a situation where actually people are going to use them in all sorts of ways which perhaps we wouldn't wish they would.
My goodness, Aiden, Mellor, that is a very interesting subject to open up, and a fairly scary one. Thank you so much for coming on the programme, and thank you for letting us see Adar. Coming up, everyone's favourite Doctor Who, David Tennant, is back in front of a live audience. He's starring in a play called Good. It's about a German doctor swept along by Nazism. As he wrestles whether to take a stand or just get on with his ordinary life, it raises the question, what would you do in the same situation? Coming up after the break.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday, and there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh my goodness me!
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back to Portillo, your Sunday morning serving of topical conversation, debate, arts and culture. This week, David Tennant returned to the stage in Good, a revival of C.P. Taylor's play about a good man's relationship with an evil ideology. Tennant plays a German academic, Professor Halder, the good man in the title, living in Germany in the 1930s as Nazism takes control of his country. Well, since the war, Germany has had to confront its responsibility in that period and deal with its guilt for the war and the Holocaust. Those of us who live in other countries have largely been able to avoid the uncomfortable question of how we might have reacted individually and en masse had our country fallen victim to a dictator with a programme for annihilating the Jews. As many witnesses from the time and historians have reminded us, the advance of Nazism was gradual. Many believed that Nazism would become more moderate or that its excesses could be controlled. But in fact, most people accepted what was going on and conformed. If there was a moment to stop Hitler, it was missed by the German population and by the international community. David Fine is a theatre-goer and joins me with Stefan Kyriazis, the arts editor of Express Online. You both went to see the play. David, being Jewish, would you have chosen to go to see the play? Because we actually asked you to go to see it. Would you have chosen to go?
Yeah, I think I would, both from a subject matter perspective and also as a theatre goer. You know, it's got a great cast in terms of David Tennant and the others. So, yeah, it would have been on my list for sure.
And how did you find the treatment of this subject?
Yeah, look, I think it's a very difficult subject. I think what's interesting is this play takes the perspective of the perpetrator, right, not the victim, and as such, that's really quite problematic when you hear someone justifying Kristallnacht. That becomes immediately challenging and a difficult watch. And the production treads this fine line between keeping you at a distance. You can't sympathise too much with that character, or else it becomes complicit in that sort of idea about understanding and empathising with Nazism. So it's a challenging watch.
So broadly speaking, this character goes through the process that I was describing in my introduction, does he? That is to say, in the end, he does nothing. It just goes on around him, and he's swept up in it.
Yeah, he's seduced by it and actually becomes he becomes very high up in the SS, and actually his writing is used to justify euthanasia and then ultimately the concentration camp. So he becomes very bound up in the upper echelons of Nazism.
Wow. Stefan, should we talk about the play artistically and the performances and so on? How did you find it with your critical eye?
My critical eye, critically, I think the performances are excellent. David Tennant is very, very good at portraying somebody that on the surface seems to be rather affable and a likeable chap, but underneath there's something darker going on, something a little bit more disturbing, and he's excellent at that. The other two people on stage are Sharon Small and Elliot Levy, both superb. For me, this play was originally staged and written for a much larger cast, and what they've got here is David Tennant on his own is playing Professor John Halder. The other two are playing everybody else. So you almost, and they're playing, there's a lot of chopping, changing between scenes, often during a scene, where you have Sharon or Elliot actually swapping between characters. It can be a little bit distracting. For me, it prevents me getting entirely engaged. I think they did a tremendous job of it. I'm not sure that it completely pays off as a way of staging this when there are so many ideas, so many personalities, so much going on. For me, I struggled, and the staging is very purposefully bare, a little bit oppressive. It's either a concrete cell, it could be outside, a waiting room outside in Auschwitz, it could be just a function room. It's very anonymous, and that's quite oppressive. So the whole evening is hard work. It's important. Did I enjoy it? I'm not entirely sure. And was I entirely convinced by the ideas they're trying to get across? I'm not entirely sure.
What about its artistic bravery, Stefan? Is it artistically brave?
In terms of the ideas it's presenting, when it was written in 1982, it's a very bold, strong idea. I think the whole concept hangs on a good man, and then we go into the whole definition of what is good. We all like to think we're good. But for me, I need someone to be a little bit more of an everyman. If I'm going to engage and be a little bit queasy watching, thinking, oh, if I was in that situation, would I really have stood up? Would I have spoken up? Would I have looked the other way? Or it's more asking you to think, would I have taken advantage of the situation? which is what this character does.
I didn't know how the plot developed in the way that David has described, and in a way, it seems in a way that takes an easy route, because of course we're going to be absolutely against someone who becomes an SS officer. I mean, the typical experience, I'm going to put this to David, the typical experience in Nazi Germany was not that people rose to senior ranks in the Nazi party, but simply that they never did anything. There was a wonderful diary written at the time by a fellow called, I think it was Stefan Hafner. It's called Defying Hitler. And this fellow is a barrister. And there's a moment when he's in the barristers' library in Berlin, and all the barristers are there, obviously quite a number of them are Jewish, and I think an SS officer comes in, and he says, all non-Aryans stand up.
Yeah.
And he says, why didn't I stand up at that moment? So have you reflected on that experience,
Absolutely.
David?
And I think the play asks that talks about being good and also doing good, right? And I think there's a lot in the play where he, Halder, the David Tennant character, sort of justifies intellectually, theoretically, his capitulation. But there's also this, and that's quite abstract, but there's this extraordinary moment where he comes downstage and has a monologue where he says, look, I love my family, I love my kids, I love my job. I love the Jews, but they're low down on my list. Intellectually, they're very high up. And I thought that's a real insight there, isn't it? That you can care about a lot of things, but actually what motivates you to action is the things that are most precious to you and that you love. So it sort of provides an insight into how and why people do nothing when what they're doing is focusing on what's nearest and dearest to them. So as a Jew, yes, it answers your question about why I went to see the play. But, you wonder who else is going to go and see this play if it wasn't with David Tennant in it?
It seems deeply uncomfortable. And I might just mention to viewers a wonderful book by a friend of mine, Julia Boyd. It's called A Village in the Third Reich. Right. And it's an alpine village. It's a ski resort with, by the way, a lot of Jewish tourists, so they're a little bit ambiguous about that. They vote for Hitler in 1933, not entirely knowing what they're getting. And then everything about their life is very gradually, day by day, bit by bit, Nazified. The town council is Nazified, the golf club is Nazified, the bridge club is Nazified. There's just, and there's a fellow who is relatively good. There is a mayor who is a Nazi, but nonetheless, there are various examples of his mercy and consideration. So this subject is very much around. Thank you both. I've enormously valued this discussion. Terrific contributions. Thank you, David Fine and Stephanie Kyriazis. Coming up, with the government in disarray, what is the role of the 1922 committee? And if a thing is good enough for the Premiership's leading goal scorer, then might it be good enough for me and you? Celebrity chef Aldo Zili will be here to discuss offal. But first, the weather.
Looking ahead to today's weather, and the UK is looking blustery, with showers becoming confined to the far north. Elsewhere, mostly dry. Let's take a look at the details. Across the south and west, it'll be dry with plenty of sunshine during the morning, although some cloud will spread across the region later as it becomes increasingly breezy. A dry start across the south and east with plenty of sunshine. However, cloud will move across the region from south during the morning. A fine and dry start with an ample supply of sunshine during the morning in Wales. Cloud will increase from the south by late morning. The Midlands will be fine and dry with prolonged sunny spells for all during the morning. However, cloudier skies will spread northwards from late morning. Winds mostly light but becoming slightly breezier into the afternoon. North East England will also be dry with prolonged sunny spells, slightly cloudier in the far west with some patchy rain around. Winds mostly light but will increase into the afternoon. Rather windy with showers continuing to affect the north and west of Scotland during the morning, but these easing somewhere into the afternoon. Elsewhere dry with decent sunny spells. In Northern Ireland, it'll be dry with lots of sunshine at first. However, skies will turn increasingly hazy from mid-morning as cloud with outbreaks of rain arrive from the south during the afternoon. Cloud and rain, accompanied with strong winds, will spread north and east during the afternoon and evening. And that is how the weather is shaping up for the rest of the day.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other pay-per-review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Good morning again and welcome back to Portillo, filling your Sunday mornings with good conversation, arts and entertainment, ethical dilemmas and a sense of the ridiculous too. Coming up, footballer Erling Haaland is having a phenomenal time at the moment, 15 goals in 9 Premier League games. He puts it down to his diet of offal. Celebrity chef Aldo Zilli will be here to discuss whether a diet of liver and hearts will keep you scoring. And with the turmoil in the government, might we see the 1922 committee take centre stage again? What exactly is the committee? Why does it exist? All that to come after the news with Tamsin.
Michael, thank you very much. Good morning. It's 1 minute past 11. Here are the top stories. The Prime Minister and her new Chancellor will work on restoring credibility when they meet later, following weeks of economic turmoil and policy U-turns. Jeremy Hunt is now putting together a new fiscal plan after saying the mini-budget went too far, too fast. He's still warning of a difficult period, saying some taxes won't be cut as quickly as people want. Others will rise and spending could be squeezed to help balance the books. The Chancellor, who insists Liz Truss is still in charge, spoke to BBC Sunday with Laura Koonsberg.
I talked it through with the Prime Minister and I wanted to check that she was happy that I'm totally honest with people about the challenge. And we are going to have to take some very difficult decisions, both on spending and on tax. Spending is not going to increase by as much as people hoped.
Well, the Shadow Business Secretary, Jonathan Reynolds, is calling for a general election.
It's not about a change of Chancellor. Look, they can't simply reverse what they've done through something as straightforward as that. They can't simply get around the fact that the Bank of England and the government have been in completely different places for the last month. They've got to recognise what they have done requires the chance for a real fresh start, and that will require a general election.
The Home Secretary has announced plans to crack down on protests that cause serious disruption and threaten public safety. Suella Braverman says the measures aim to stop demonstrators from holding the public to ransom. She says police will be given new powers to take a more proactive approach, specifically targeting tactics used by some climate activists. The Home Office says it will include protecting access to essential goods, services and key infrastructure. The government is pushing ahead with a law to keep Britain moving during transport strikes. Legislation will be introduced to ensure minimum service levels are maintained during a walkout. Unions are criticising the move, saying it will be unworkable. It's after a summer of travel chaos caused by disputes over pay and conditions. The measures are expected to come into force next year. Travel expert Simon Calder says there are practical problems that need to be worked out.
If you say, right, we're going to run 40% of trains, who decides which ones those are and who decides who's allowed to go on them? Because they're all going to fill up. So there's lots of problems associated with it. And as you were saying, it's not going to come until next year anyway, if it gets through a very divided Parliament. And it will be interesting to see how it does work and whether you can actually do this.
At least 11 people have been killed and 15 others injured by gunmen at a military training ground in Russia. A Russian state news agency says 2 people opened fire on volunteers training to fight in Ukraine. They were shot dead after the attack. Ukraine says the attackers were from Tajikistan. Russia's defence ministry claims they were from a former Soviet republic. 4 prisoners have been killed and 61 injured in a fire at an Iranian prison last night, according to state media. Protesters have since been marching towards the prison in support of its inmates. The unrest comes after the death of Mahsa Amini, who allegedly violated the country's strict dress code for women, sparking widespread protests. The prison primarily holds Iran's political detainees. Security officials say calm has been restored at the prison. A fall in the value of the pound has added 7 pence per litre to petrol bills over the past year. The Competition and Markets Authority found rising oil prices and bigger profit margins at refineries are also driving up fuel costs, accounting for a 20 pence hike in prices. Government figures show the average price of a litre of petrol is now £1.62 compared to £1.37 a year ago. More than 1,000 Paddington teddy bears left by members of the public in memory of the late Queen have found a new home. An image of the Queen consort surrounded by the toys has been released to mark the donation to children's charity Barnardo's. The bears were left at Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle after the passing of the late Queen. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens. Now it's back to Michael.
Welcome back to Portillo. There are already laws that govern human interactions with nature, for example, safeguarding certain wildlife or granting land protection status. This week, in a report for the Law Society, it's been argued that we should grant legal rights to non-human entities such as animals, trees, and rivers. The purpose of the report is, quote, meaningful coexistence and, quote, new alliances for cooperation instead of competition. Such a change in legislation would have very important consequences, as the report hints. It points out that if rights were granted to non-humans or living systems, then questions of liability for damage to the environment, such as climate change or biodiversity loss, arise. Well, you can regard that as an effective protection for the environment or a nightmare of litigation whenever we want to build a house, dig a sewer, or lay a cable. Should we change the law in a way that implies that humans and animals, or for that matter, humans and trees, humans and rivers, are of the same moral order? The Conservative peer Lord Moylan has written extensively about the concept of animal sentience, and he joins me now. It's very good to see you, Daniel. This is not entirely about animal sentience, although that might be a part of it. What do you think of the idea of giving rights to non-human actors?
Well, it's a fascinating topic, isn't it? And it raises lots of interesting problems. And I think the first thing I'd say is that it's a tremendous impoverishment of legal thinking that they can only think in terms of rights, that if you want to achieve something, it has to be by granting rights. And this has been the growth of the rights culture in the legal mind, to the exclusion of everything else over the last 40 or 50 years. There is another way of thinking about it, of course, and that is that human beings are a higher order of life, but with that comes a sense of obligation, and we already articulate that. We put obligations on human beings in certain ways, as you said, to protect certain types of landscapes or rivers or natural features, to treat animals in a way which is what we would call humane, because the moral order is a human thing. It's not something in which rocks and rivers participate. So first of all, it's an impoverishment. But the second thing I think that I'd want to say about it is that there are two ways in which the state is expanding in new ways into controlling our lives. And one of them is driven by climate change, because the essence of this report is the notion of climate change is partly driving this. And the other way is through health and through an expansion of control over our health and driving our behavior on health grounds. Well, that's not in contention this morning, but the question about expanding government control on the basis of climate change is very clear. And I think we need to be very, very wary about this, because that's what's behind it. It's really a means of control.
For people who are worried about climate change, about trees, about rivers, about animals, even tiny animals, is there another way to make things better from their point of view? Are there protections that could be increased without going the rights route?
Well, clearly there are. And if a government decides legitimately, and it has a consensus for this, that it's in the common good that you shouldn't pollute water, for example, pollute rivers, then it can take measures to do so, and it can punish people, industrial undertakings or big farms or whatever, that do pollute rivers, and we do that already. And you can extend that in other ways. I mean, chalk streams have been protected recently, more recently than, but specifically because of the sort of biodiversity and ecology that exists in chalk streams. So it's possible to do that on the basis of a reasoned argument, and the grounds for doing it is the common good. It's something that we share, that individuals can't protect on their own. You need to have some overarching protection, in the same way that you did with public health. When you drove back in the 19th century, you largely drove typhus and cholera out of the water supply, because people can't protect themselves from those diseases. They have to drink water. So someone has to take action in the common good.
It would have been great if we could have had an author of the report, or a representative of the author of the report. But one of the things that struck me is that in human communication, we tend to think of rights and responsibilities as being balanced. So I get a right, but I have a responsibility. You can't give responsibilities to rivers and trees, even to ants or to sheep. And that strikes me as quite a big problem.
Well, you can't give responsibilities to them, and it's also difficult to know, in terms of damages, how you compensate them. So if they have rights and their environment has been compromised, you'd normally pursue a route according to damages. You know, if this was your house and somebody knocked a bit of it down, or they'd done something to your garden, you'd be entitled to damages. How do they articulate their rights is the first question. How do they appoint lawyers? Well, of course, lawyers will appoint themselves, is what's actually going to happen, and take it up on them, on their behalf. And secondly, how do you compensate them? So I think the legal framework is all wrong.
I think the breadth of this is quite staggering in its implications. If we are developing a motorway or building a railway, of course we need to be aware of owl or bat or newt populations, and there are all sorts of special safeguards. But by and large, if I'm building an extension to my house, I'm not, I think, required to go into all of that. But this rights-based legislation would presumably mean that if unintentionally I damaged a newt on the way, or if I did something to the water supply, or I don't know, if I damaged a tree, well, I'm quite likely to damage a tree when I build an extension to my house, that all these things have rights. It seems to me almost limitless in its application.
Well, as I say, it's a mechanism for control, and it's also a mechanism, frankly, for preventing human development. Because
it's a pity that Liz Truss didn't know about this when she talked about the anti-growth coalition.
Anti-growth coalition. But then it also raises other questions. I mean, I came here in my car, and my car is also made up of natural materials. Everything in it has come out of the earth one way or the other. And it's a great deal more intelligent than a pile of rocks. And it talks to me, it tells me when I'm wandering out of the lane. If I'm speeding, it has a thing that comes up, tells me to cut the speed and so on. So why doesn't my car have rights? Or we were just interviewing, we didn't quite interview Aida, the talking robot.
Ada. Mm-hmm.
Ada, sorry, the talking robot. Why isn't she more entitled to rights than an inert bunch of rocks or a piece of field or a tree?
Shall we leave agreeing with each other on this subject to one side? You are a Tory peer, amongst other things. What are your feelings today about the condition of the Prime Minister?
Well, I'm in a state of great depression. I voted for Liz Truss because she was pointing in the right direction, but I didn't have enormous confidence that she would set off or go very far in that direction, but I had hopes. But there has been now a complete reversal on economic policy, and we've adopted Sunakonics, if there is such a thing, without Sunak. And I think we are condemning ourselves to what somebody's called a loop of doom, and when we're not following the right economic policies for the country. And I think the Conservative Party has to think very carefully what it's for now. It doesn't surprise me entirely, if you've got a second. My thesis has always been that this big shift in the discourse, the polarities of political discourse over the last 10 or 15 years, away from what politicians have been used to and more into areas to do with climate change, identity politics, nationalism, things of that sort, always had the potential to destroy both the main political parties. And it came very clear because their coalitions clustered around other issues. And this nearly happened to the Labour Party in December 29, and they completely walloped. They didn't see it coming, and they were completely blown over. And I'm afraid the Conservatives drew the wrong lesson from that, because they thought, well, of course, Labour have lost it, but that's because we've got it right. But I don't think they had thought through that they have to change as well. And now I think what we're seeing is the other shoe dropping.
The lady that you voted for a few weeks ago, should she remain?
I think it's very difficult for her to remain, to be perfectly frank. And speaking this entirely my own thoughts. But I think she can. I think if the party rallies round and decides that it knows what to do, I think she can. And it's up to her to show that she's worthy of that. But I don't think it's a slam dunk, and I think she might have to go.
A carefully hedged answer, I think, Lord Boylan. Very nice to see.
It's not for me to say. We sit in the House of Lords and we don't have any votes on this 1922 committee you're about to discuss.
No, indeed
so
you don't.
You've got to talk to an MP to find out.
And you had a vote as a simple lay member.
When I voted for Liz Truss, I simply voted like any other member of the party. Yes, that's right.
Very demotic. Thank you, Lord Boylan. Coming up, what does it take to stand up and speak out? In this age of cancel culture, do we need more people who have the courage to be a contrarian? After the break.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club. Oh my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilized conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Faro.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know, the latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
Welcome back to Portillo. 100 years ago, Britain was led by a coalition government, a legacy of the First World War. The Prime Minister was David Lloyd George, a Liberal politician who'd been in ministerial office since 1905 and was credited with having won the war, becoming Premier in 1916. He was also one of the key figures in devising the New World Order at the Treaty of Versailles, and he was a colossus in British and global politics. But the coalition was made up principally of Conservative members of Parliament, many of whom came to resent his leadership. Lloyd George was involved in a scandal selling honours, and his private life raised eyebrows. He was involved in a foreign policy adventure that went wrong, and the Conservatives took fright at a bad by-election result. The Labour Party was on the rise. Boris Johnson's fate reminded me very much of Lloyd George. On the 19th of October, 100 years ago, the Conservative Parliamentary Party met at the Carlton, the party's London club, and after a heated debate, voted to end the coalition. Lloyd George was ejected out of government, out of Downing Street. The Colonial Secretary, Winston Churchill, another Liberal, was out too. The Conservative Parliamentary Party had asserted itself. The following year, after a general election, a committee of all Conservative backbench MPs was set up and was named the 1922 Committee. It may have been called after the date of the general election, but given that it had been in 1922 that the party had shown a Prime Minister that it was boss, I've always thought that its name carries more than a whiff of menace. In the present chaos, the 1922 may be encouraged again to flex its muscles. Philip Norton, Lord Norton of Louth, has been described as the United Kingdom's greatest living expert on Parliament, and he joins me now. You're going to tell me that the foundation of the 1922 committee has nothing to do with the ousting of Lloyd George. But let's join up the dots anyway.
Right. Well, there are two myths about the 22 committee, one of which you've already addressed, because quite a number of texts say it takes its name from the date in which it was founded. The other is that it came out of the meeting of the Carlton Club, which you've outlined. Neither is correct. I mean, if you touched upon, it takes its name from the fact it was formed of members newly elected in the general election of 1922, which of course was very late in the year following the collapse of the coalition. So in April 1923, one new backbencher, Gervase Rentoul, barrister, had been elected for Lowestoft, no parliamentary experience, arrived at Westminster. As you well know, some new MPs arrive at Westminster never having visited Parliament before, was bewildered by what was going on. And he talked to some other new MPs, they were bewildered. They got together on the 18th of April and decided, let's set up a committee. Met again on the 25th and agreed that they would have a body for mutual cooperation in dealing with parliamentary affairs and to enable new members to take a greater part in parliamentary affairs. So it was really a self-help group for new members. Of course, being new MPs, they weren't involved in the Carlton Club meeting. And so it was a fairly limited body. It was confined to new MPs. Following the next election, which came very quickly, of course, because Baldwin called an election late in 23, they opened it up to members newly elected in 1923. Of which there weren't that many, because the Conservatives did rather badly. It's only in the following Parliament they then opened it up to all Conservative private members. So it became a much larger group.
All Conservative members who weren't in ministerial posts.
Yeah, exactly, because the formal name was the Conservative Private Members Bracket 1922 Committee. So yes, private members. So it was opened up. But for many years, really until the Second World War, it was sort of a discussion group for information, for sharing information, limited impact on what government was doing. So there are really three key periods in its history leading up to where we are now. One is that formation of new MPs, a sort of discussion group. The other was the formation of a national government in 1940, because that created conditions that really allowed the 22 to come into its own. And then it built on that in post-war years.
To come into its own because it needed to continue to represent the interests of the Conservative Party in a multi-party coalition.
Exactly. So the government required unity in the whole House. It was a national government, and most party organisation, of course, ceased. So the 22 was the authentic voice of the Conservative Party. And, of course, government needed to keep members on side. So ministers were going along, including Labour ministers, to talk to the 22 to make sure that any dissatisfaction was kept there. And of course, there's quite a lot on the conduct of the war initially. And so that really set it up. It actually acquired quite an active chairman, Alec Erskine-Hill, who really pushed the role of the committee. Then developed in post-war years, of course, Conservative government under Winston Churchill, with Churchill having no idea about domestic policy, wasn't that interested. So he didn't so much lead as preside, and that sort of created a vacuum into which backbenchers could come. So, for example, getting rid of the BBC's broadcasting monopoly derives from members of the 22 pushing government, which resisted, but managed to get their way. And you got the first with Critchell down in 1954, a minister resigning, Tommy Dugdale, when he realised he'd lost the confidence of the 22. So it really developed then. And the third critical stage was 1965, the introduction of rules for electing the leader. And, of course, the election was organised and by the 22, with the chairman of 22, having basic control of the proceedings. So you have to have a chairman of the 22 in place before you can have an election of the party leader. And of course, it's developed from there.
Developed because now all members of the party out in the country, as it were, also get the vote. That's a fairly recent change. I might just say that, of course, I used to attend the 22 when I was a backbencher. I wasn't a backbencher all that much. And mainly it's rather dull and routine. So they meet in Committee Room 14, which is a very large room.
Yes.
The whip comes and reads the business for the following week, including the whipping. In other words, how important is it that you should turn up in the following week, which your day's off? This actually guarantees a fairly good attendance because people are interested to know whether they can scarper the following week or not.
Oh, indeed.
But then every now and again, it will invite a minister or a prime minister, or if it's in opposition, of course, the equivalent, to come and address. And these can be important occasions. There is the tradition of banging the desk. So instead of simply applauding or saying hooray or whatever, you bang the desk. The principal reason for this seems to be that the press is outside in the corridor and you wish to give the impression, even if it's entirely false, that the minister or prime minister was heard rapturously. But actually things can be a bit more intense.
They can, and that your description is absolutely spot on. I've been attending the 22 for the past 24 years. And you get that, as you say, that variation. You can have a minute attendance when there's not much on. I mean, I remember one week it was so small I got a cheer when I entered the room. But on other occasions, as you say, the attendance, it's absolutely a bit like last Wednesday when Liz Truss spoke. The room was absolutely packed, standing room only. And so at critical points, I mean, you got this, during the Suez crisis with Aiden, absolutely, Committee Room 14, absolutely jam-packed. So you get that sense of occasion, and of course you detect the mood. Which can mislead people outside, because you say the journalists are there, they're listening. but that doesn't always reflect
No.
the actual
And of
serious
course,
questions. Yes.
Nowadays you have competitive leaking, so people go out
yes.
there and give their version, their spin on.
Well, you notice that from Wednesday. If you look at the next day's media, some people say, oh, it wasn't a bad, very good. Others were absolutely disastrous. So it's interested comment, so it's not objective.
Do you think the 22 is continuing to evolve? I'm sure the answer to that is yes. We are in a very perilous situation at the moment. Might the chairman of the 22, or might the 22 itself, the executive perhaps, do something in these circumstances that it's never done before?
Potentially, and you've just touched upon a vital point, which is so often overlooked. You're quite right. The weekly meeting of the 22, quite often low attendance, it's just business. And at various periods, that's all it's really been, depending on who's been the chairman. But what is crucial is what happens before the full 22, which is the meeting of the executive. And that quite often has a significant agenda each week. It will see ministers, and in a way that's where it discusses what do we do about the current crisis, and it is the executive that will doubtless be discussing what do we do, given the rules in place at the moment, when one didn't anticipate the situation one gets now, when you've got a new prime minister and things go so badly wrong so quickly. That's unprecedented. We've had governments before that, if you like, have imploded, but not so quickly, and the situation that faces the party, which you'll remember from Black Wednesday, the importance of that when that happens. Key to Conservative success is being able to convey you are a party of governance, that you're a safe pair of hands in handling the affairs of the nation. It's not so much the actual substance of what you do, it's conveying that you're a competent government, you know where you're going. Margaret Thatcher was superb at identifying where she was going. She could be quite pragmatic in getting there. As one of her cabinet colleagues put it to me, she could recognise a brick wall when she saw one. So she'd worked to get there. But of course, after, when John Major came in, as you know, you had Black Wednesday, sudden collapse in confidence in the government. And that is the big challenge to government. How do you overcome that? And that's the challenge facing the 22. Do you stick with the existing rules, in which case the leader can't be challenged, a new leader for a year, or do you actually change the rules?
I have a feeling the brick wall may have reappeared. Many thanks to Philip Norton, Lord Norton of Louth. Coming up, what does it take to speak up and speak out? First, the news headlines with Tamsin.
Michael, thank you. It's 11:30. Here are the top stories from the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister and her new Chancellor will work on restoring credibility when they meet later, following weeks of economic turmoil and policy U-turns. Jeremy Hunt is now putting together a new fiscal plan after saying the mini-budget went too far, too fast. He's still warning of a difficult period, saying some taxes won't be cut as quickly as people want. Others will rise and spending could be squeezed to help balance the books. The Home Secretary has announced plans to crack down on protests that cause serious disruption and threaten public safety. Suella Braverman says the measures aim to stop demonstrators from holding the public to ransom. She says police will be given new powers to take a more proactive approach, specifically targeting tactics used by some climate activists. The government is pushing ahead with a law to keep Britain moving during transport strikes. Legislation will be introduced to ensure minimum service levels are maintained during a walkout. Unions are criticising the move, saying it will be unworkable. The measures are expected to come into force next year. Iran says 4 prisoners have been killed and 61 injured in a fire at Tehran's Evin prison. It happened as unrest continues following the death of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who died in custody after allegedly violating the country's strict dress code for women. Security officials say calm has been restored at the prison. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens, of course. Now, though, it's back to Michael.
Tamsin, thank you. The course of history has often been changed by one person speaking out. William Wilberforce cried out against the institution of slavery. Charles Darwin described how the biodiversity of our world has emerged over billions of years through a process of evolution by natural selection. Mary Wollstonecraft spoke up for the education of women in professions such as medicine at a time when most females were expected to stay at home. As John Stuart Mill wrote, quotes, "If all mankind minus one were of one opinion, and only one person were of the contrary opinion, mankind would be no more justified in silencing that one person than he, if he had the power, would be justified in silencing mankind." End of quote. One reason, but only one, is that all mankind might be wrong, and the one person might be right. The role of the contrarian is not an easy one. He can be vilified, ostracized, silenced. Whistleblowers in particular may bring about great social or economic change, or even expose criminal activity, but at enormous cost to themselves and their families. And now with social media, the act of speaking out may lead to being cancelled or having a reputation destroyed. The Contrarian Prize was founded 10 years ago to celebrate the independence, courage and sacrifice of people who have made a meaningful contribution to public debate by standing up for what they believe in. Previous winners have included Toby Young, Catherine Birbal-Singh and Professor Patrick Minford. Ali Miraj is the founder of the Contrarian Prize and he joins me now. The three that we just mentioned there are figures who are somewhat beloved of the right. May I just check that you would also have contrarians who were beloved of the left?
Of course. One of them was the lawyer, Clive Stafford Smith, who believes in standing up for people on death row. He's very much a man of the left. I mean, the initial winner, Michael, was a guy called Michael Woodford, who's a businessman. So he actually won the prize for standing up against basically wrongdoing in his company, the first CEO in history to blow the whistle on his own company when he discovered a $1.7 billion fraud at Olympus. First time in history, he got called in by the board, complained, said he wanted to investigate it, and they fired him. So there are people from different sides of the political spectrum that have won this prize, and it's open to all.
Nominations are made, I presume. Is that how it works?
They are. The nominations are made by the public via the website. And we're looking for 4 different criteria, Michael. And we thought about these very, very carefully when we founded the prize. Independence of thought, courage and conviction in their actions. They should have made a sacrifice for their beliefs. And they should have also introduced new ideas into the public realm or had an impact on the public debate. And there are really 2 types of contrarians, Michael, as I see it. One is the contrarian who's been contrarian, as I would say, since they've been in nappies, the kind of Peter Tatchell of this world, he's been campaigning since 55 years, since he was 15, right? You have that kind of contrarian, but you also have the other kind of contrarian who comes to a fork in the road and they say, can I take the path of conviction or convenience? Is my career more important than my conscience? And that's where the Michael Woodford Olympus whistleblower type comes in. So, or Robin Cook, who resigned over the Iraq War. You know, I mean, he was never a rebel. So you have 2 types of contrarians, in my view, and both of them have a role to play in British public life. And the reason why I set up this prize, Michael, 10 years ago, was because at that time, back in 2012, if you recall, we'd had the Hillsborough cover-up, we'd had a financial crisis, we'd had the MP's expenses scandal, we'd had the systematic abuse of kids by certain figures, and you just thought, like, why did no one speak up about this stuff? And for me, it's very personal. I remember when I was standing for Parliament back in 2003, I basically was interviewed about the Iraq War. My party, the Conservative Party at the time, was supporting the war, and I felt that it was wrong, and I stood up against it. And I think it's important to have the courage of your convictions and take the path of not conviction, not convenience, but conviction.
During your list of the excellent criteria on which you judge the prize, you mentioned sacrifice. Give me some examples of what people have sacrificed, not necessarily prize winners, but others who have really paid a price for speaking up.
Well, I mean, Michael Woodford's an example, but if you look at someone like Catherine Birbal-Singh, take her example. Now, she is someone who has set up a school, the Michaela School, that believes in a certain way of teaching, discipline, rigor, standards in the school. And she was vilified for doing this. I remember when she gave that speech some years ago, Michael, in Birmingham, when she was cheered to the rafters by the people in the hall. And I thought that speech was very punchy. I mean,
was this at a Conservative Party
conference? This was a Conservative Party conference.
So that obviously had tainted her in the minds of some people.
Absolutely, and she was very much a person of the left. I mean, she herself says that when she was at university, she was very sort of flirted with Marxism. But she had realised during the course of her teaching, and she taught in a number of different schools, that those teaching methods were not working. The orthodoxy that was prevailing the educational system was failing kids. So she spoke out. That sacrifice that she made was effectively she got pushed out of her job as a deputy head in Camberwell and was in the wilderness for like 3 to 4 years trying to find out what to do with her life. She was trying to set up a school in the face of horrendous opposition. And you find this during history, Michael. I mean, people who speak up, look at Tom Paine, back in the 18th century, a person who was political philosopher, fundamentally had an impact on both the French Revolution and the American Revolution. At his death, 6 people turned up when he died. Same with Galileo Galilei. He was talking about the Copernican theory that the Earth moves around the sun, condemned as a heretic and had to live under house arrest. So it was absolutely, the way you framed it at the beginning, I totally agree with, in terms of these people are often dismissed as fruitcakes, dissenters, nutcases. But often, in time, they are proved to be right. And that we should have respect for people who are contrarian. I'm not saying you can have contrarians everywhere.
But even if they're not right, they'll still be defended.
Absolutely correct. Because for me, they're like, Michael, I think that they're the yeast in the mix. I mean, I'm not saying that you could have, for example, a parliament. Look, Simon Danchuk, a Labour MP, by the way, won the prize. He won it because he spoke out against child abuse. He was calling at the time for an inquiry from the Home Secretary.
Rochdale.
Absolutely. He talked out about that. Now, I'm not saying that you can run a country with 650 contrarians in Parliament. You get very little done. But you need them. They're the yeast in the mix. They are the people who speak truth to power. They are unbowed and uncowed in their defence of what they actually believe. And I think that's right. And I also think that, by the way, there are also, as I say, the whistleblower types who never sought to be contrarian, but they come to that fork in the road where they can stay silent or speak out. And that takes courage and conviction to do it.
Is the lot of the contrarian getting worse because of social media at the moment?
I think it's very difficult to be contrarian now. And in fact, some positions that were considered quite mainstream are now considered contrarian. So a lot of the stuff about the whole trans debate and about biological sex and all these things, which some people find very confusing. Even if you wanted to express an opinion about the importance of biological sex, you're closed down. And that creates a lot of problems. I mean, we should be able to have an open, respectful discourse. Social media, Michael, is poisonous, absolutely poisonous. It actually, all these algorithms push people to the fringes and to the edge, to get clicked, to get noticed, and that's not a way to have a nuanced argument. A lot of these issues that we're dealing with at the moment, and look at the state the country's in at the moment, are nuanced, they're difficult. And I remember back in 2000, Michael, when you gave that speech, I was in the hall in Bournemouth when you gave that speech to the Conservative Party, and you actually came out, you showed courage at the time, by giving them a lot of home truths at the time about how to get re-elected. They had to actually move towards the centre, move towards respecting people of different sexuality, move towards respecting people of different ethnic backgrounds. I remember that, and that took a lot of guts.
Well, thank you for saying that. But in view of what you say about the deteriorating situation in social media, what words of encouragement could you say to a contrarian? Let's say that someone at the moment is wrestling with an issue at their employer. They see something terrible that's going on, and they're worried about whether to speak up or not. What words of encouragement?
Well, I think you can find a way. It is difficult sometimes because debate is basically closed down, and it's been closed down across the thing. And a lot of people say that, no, this is all imagined and it's all fine. It's not. I mean, you look at a report by Policy Exchange for people on university campuses, academics, for example, 50% of them are self-censoring because they feel that if their views do not conform to those that are considered acceptable, they will hamper their chances of career advancement. And you know, in the academic world in particular, Michael, it's all peer-reviewed. So what we need is some decency in the discourse, some respect for people of different views. We've got to also build in resilience. I mean, Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff wrote a book a couple of years ago called The Coddling of the American Mind. The fact that, we're so fragile now that we can't hear anything we disagree with, and it affects us. I mean, almost psychologically affects us. This is wrong. We need to teach people resilience and to conduct debate in a respectful but robust manner.
Is your prize helping?
I think it's never been a more important time for the prize. I must say, Michael, I've had moments during the 10 years when, particularly in the last year or so, when I thought, can I actually run a prize where you've actually got people who are being nominated for it, sometimes who feel it's not in good faith. They think, oh, there must be some agenda, or they don't want to be seen to win a prize which will upset their former tribe that they were belonged to, which they've now been expelled by, which they're trying to paper over the cracks quickly to get back into again. So you need to have a certain amount of good faith to run a prize like this, but I think it's fundamentally important. I believe that contrarians are the ones that often advance society, and as you say, even if they don't, they hold us to account. They make us almost improve our own arguments. I mean, if you're just closing down debate and speaking to people you agree with, how do you, as Karl Popper said, actually have that argumentation and disputation where you actually advance your theory and, in fact, even make it better when you actually argue against someone who tears it apart? I mean, how do we do that, Michael?
So Karl Popper, Galileo, John Stuart Mill, Thomas Paine. We've had them all this morning on GB News. Many thanks to Ali Miraj. Coming up, Chef Aldo Zili will be here to talk about food trends from offal to alcohol-free gin. That's after the break.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around with all the biggest topics and guests. You will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch. You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me.
And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other pay-per-review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
Welcome back. As we run up to Christmas, there's just 70 days to go, if you're counting. Our thoughts turn to food and drink. Gone are the salads and soft fruit of summer. Instead, we're now thinking of nourishing, warming food. What is on trend for food this autumn? Chef Aldo Zili is here, and he's come from Casa Zili in Surrey. What have you brought in today? Welcome. It's
Buongiorno, first of all. Lovely to meet you.
Sta bene? Yes.
Fantastico. Okay, we got two little butterboards. This is the new craze on all over social media. And I don't know why, because in the 80s, when I opened my first restaurants in Soho, I was doing this already. Now it's come back round for some reason.
Right.
Yeah, so
you've taken butter and mixed it with all sorts of delicious
with all
things.
sorts of delicious. This is a dessert. This is a sweet one with honey. I mean, I've got a list here of what's got in there: unsalted butter, vanilla essence, cream, honey, raspberries, strawberries, grapes, hazelnuts, almonds, walnuts, blueberry jam, strawberry jam, and figs. There you go.
May I try that?
You may indeed. There's your knife.
When I was a bit overweight... Oh, sorry, that's your plate.
No, that's
When
okay.
I was a bit overweight, My doctor said the one thing you must give up at once is bread and butter. He said that's what's putting on the weight.
Well, I don't eat butter.
You're not going to eat this evening, no?
It's not about what, I think moderation is the word with butter. And, you got a lovely scone there, so... Good?
Probably, that is very, very good indeed.
It's like a little brunch, And then I made you some nice focaccia bread here to go with the savoury one. The savoury one has caramelized onions, prosciutto, a little bit of prosciutto there.
I've probably eaten these in the wrong order then. I should probably have eaten this one first.
Well, it doesn't matter. It's a brunch. And then the new craze as well, Michael, is these 0% gins, which you have one there to enjoy with your brunch.
But, Aldo, what is the point?
No alcohol.
What is the point of a 0%?
I've got no idea, Michael.
But they're popular, are they?
They're very, very popular. We sell so much of it. It's as expensive as a alcoholic gin.
Really? It does taste very good.
It does, doesn't it?
Mm.
I mean, if you drink that, you wouldn't really...
No, I mean, every now and again, you're looking for a substitute drink, aren't you? I mean, if you're driving,
Well, coming up to Christmas now...
You want to be sociable with other people.
It's really brilliant, actually, the fact that you can go out and have a couple of these and pretend... when I go to the bar, my local bar, I just go like that to the barman, and he knows to give me 0 gin. So I don't have to, so I can drive home, basically.
So we thought we might talk about Erling Haaland, and he says he eats offal. First of all, what is offal? What does it cover, offal?
Oh, it's an array of different
instance, is liver
inside?
offal?
Yes, inside of animals, heart, liver,
intestines,
tongue, sweetbread. There's the heart. I mean, I've been in the business for a long, long time, and we had all of those things. Kidneys, steak and kidney pie. We had all of those things on the menu in the early 80s.
I think a lot of people would eat liver, probably slightly fewer eat kidneys. But when you get towards heart and lung and intestine, I guess the number of people eating them is dropping off.
Much less.
But nutritious, would you say?
Very nutritious, full of vitamins, full of protein. It's good protein. It's not much fat in it. So, kidneys need soaking in milk so that, it gets rid of all the impurities. But the footballer, Haaland, he says that's what keeps him scoring goals. So I'm
do you know whether
thinking of going to Chelsea and doing the same thing.
Is it a Norwegian thing, do you know? Would they have more in their diet?
Not necessarily.
No.
Not
It
necessarily.
struck me as slightly odd.
Yeah.
The one I love is haggis. So that is, if I recall... Haggis is heart. And lung,
that's a mixture.
And then mixed up, and then of course it's served in the stomach of a.
Do you eat a lot of that?
I can't say I eat a lot of it, but
you eat it.
I love it when I.
Look how well you look.
Yeah.
No, on it.
No, it's a gorgeous thing. What would you say to people who feel squeamish about offal?
Try. Try. Obviously, it's not a conversation for vegetarians and vegans, but. If you're going to eat meat, if you're going to eat things that you think that you want to get healthy, you're on a health kick, those are great things to eat. And cooked right, I think that's coming back into the restaurant menus. We find that people are asking for liver again, calf's liver. So fegato veneziana used to be a big thing in the Italian restaurant menus. And we're bringing it back. So, yeah.
And also, I think you wanted to mention canned fish. Canned fish is making a bit of a comeback, possibly for reasons of economy, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, canned fish has never gone away, but it's a big thing that is going to come back now, as you said, in the economy. Alistair's going to have a gin and tonic in a minute.
Yes, Alistair Stewart has crept in.
How could I not creep in, seeing my lovely friend Aldo, one of the great revolutionaries of all matters catering?
Absolutely.
We actually bumped into one another before, and he'd explained what that was. I just think it's sensational. It just looks brilliant, and I'm sure tastes brilliant.
Do you mind if I just finish off about canned fish with Aldo for a moment? Canned fish.
Sorry, Alistair.
Is there any danger that we are getting a product which is not as nutritious as we hope it will be in a canned fish? Do we lose much when we put a fish in a can?
Yes, we do lose. Obviously, fresh is best. Cured, smoked is best. But can is always going to lose some of the protein and some of the goodness that we have in it, some of the minerals. But, if you're talking about economy, then people will go for it. And I think they should. If you're going to have a sauce with canned tuna, with olives, onions, garlic and chili, and a little bit of tomato, why not?
You can brighten it up.
Yes.
And you can bring back some of the vitamins and so on that you
with other vegetables.
Does a chef ever use canned fish?
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
Not necessarily.
That would mean no. Tell me about your place in Surrey.
We started in the pandemic doing takeaways and delivery service because all the restaurants had to close down. So we started with that, and then slowly, my wife, entrepreneurial as she is, my children, Twiggy and Rocco, helping, making pizzas and cooking with me. So I thought, well, why not do it as a business? And we started we opened our gardens now. So we have this amazing igloos in the garden, and people book them. And they fly in by helicopters. We go on helipad.
Don't mention helicopters. The climate activists will be on you.
Okay, sorry. No, they're not climate. It's electric helicopters.
This will be very popular because there are a whole lot of people out there who do a lot of work, and they will share in this delicious
100%.
food. Aldo, thank you so much. Alistair, any chance that you'll be mentioning the plight of the Prime Minister on your programme, which comes on in a moment?
Might just be in passing. I'll tell you why. You know, I've often discussed it before. I think it's one of those moments where your party is trying to either rediscover or remember, depending what tack you take, what it's really all about. Dan Hannan says in The Telegraph today, if the Tory party doesn't exist to cut taxes, what does it exist for? Although other people like John Redwood and Mark Littlewood are sort of pedalling back a little bit. Truss is, to quote Norman Lamont, in office but not in power, and Jeremy Hunt is everywhere, and pretty well everything that was in that mini budget's been rolled back, apart from the reduction in national insurance. That's the minutiae of it. What I'm really interested in is where the Tory party goes next. And I'm thrilled to bits. We've got Damien Green from one wing of the party and Christopher Chope from another wing of the party in there to talk about it. And at the end, Peter Lilly, our mutual friend, reflecting whether there may be lessons going right back to wets and dries. So I think it should be quite lively.
All of those people are my friends, and if you can get a consensus amongst them on who the next should be...
The consensus I really want is what are the big issues that we, the British people, need to get resolved for the stability of the economy and a genuine choice in democracy?
Well, Alistair, you'll be here in just a second. Adar, thank you so much for
Grazie.
being a great pleasure. Thank you not only to Alistair and to Aldo Zili, but actually to everyone who's been on the programme this morning. I found it absolutely fascinating. I will be here again next week, and I look forward to that very much indeed. But coming up now, it's the weather, followed by Alistair.
Looking ahead to this afternoon, and the UK is looking blustery, with showers becoming confined to the far north. Elsewhere, mostly dry with sunny spells. Let's take a look at the details. Blustery showers continuing to affect the north and west of Scotland, with these easing later. Elsewhere, dry with decent sunny spells. Feeling cold with a high of 11 Celsius. Becoming increasingly cloudy across Northern Ireland, but the far north and east holding on to some sunshine well into the afternoon. Temperatures reaching 11 Celsius. Dry with prolonged sunny spells. It will become increasingly hazy from the